Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where an ordinary Tuesday could quietly become a legal problem. A place where humming the wrong tune, owning the wrong hobby, or simply wanting a little extra bread on the table could put your name into a file somewhere in a gray building with no windows. Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where history gets slow enough, soft enough, and detailed enough to carry you gently into the best sleep of your week. If that sounds like your kind of evening, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy spending your nights here with me. A warm thank you, as always, to the people who leave topic suggestions in the comments. This episode exists because enough of you asked for it. And honestly, some of your comments are more interesting than my script notes. Tell me down below where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is right now, because I like imagining all of you scattered across different time zones, all drifting off together. We're also fully on Spotify now for the audio-only version. Link waiting in the description. And if you'd like the longer, ad-free cut for uninterrupted sleep, that's available through the channel membership. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let the fan hum in the background like a tired little engine, and let's begin. Picture an ordinary life. Not a dramatic one. No secret agents. No dramatic escapes. Just a person waking up, going to work, coming home, and trying to relax in the evening. Now imagine that almost every single one of those ordinary moves was, in some quiet, bureaucratic way, brushing up against the law. Imagine a country so anxious about control that it wrote rules for your job, your hobbies, your friendships, your prayers, and even the songs stuck in your head. Welcome to a single day inside the Soviet Union, somewhere in the mid-1970s. Your alarm clock is a factory siren 3 streets over. Your breakfast bread was bought in a line that started before sunrise. And before you've even finished your tea, you will have already broken at least one rule you didn't know existed. Let's walk through this day together, slowly, one small offense at a time. The radio under the pillow. It's early, still dark outside, and before anyone else in the house stirs, you reach under your pillow for a small transistor radio wrapped in a handkerchief to muffle the sound. You turn the dial with the practiced patience of someone who has done this 1,000 times, past the state stations with their brisk morning march music, hunting for a foreign signal buried under a wash of electronic static. This static wasn't an accident. It was manufactured deliberately by an entire government department whose only job was to drown out broadcasts coming from beyond the border. Somewhere out there, an actual human voice is trying to tell you the news of your own country, news your own newspapers will never print. And your job right now is simply to catch enough of the sentence before the static swallows it whole. You are not doing anything violent. You are not plotting anything. You are lying in bed with an ear pressed to a small speaker, trying to hear a man read the news calmly, without shouting slogans. And yet, this quiet act sits in a gray legal zone that could, depending on the year, and depending on who you already were to the authorities, become something much heavier than a hobby. Owning a radio was fine. Millions of people owned radios, but a habit of tuning to the foreign frequencies, especially if you were already a person of interest for some other reason, could become one more line in a file that never seemed to stop growing. The jamming towers themselves are almost a monument to how seriously the state took this. Enormous amounts of electricity, enormous amounts of equipment, enormous teams of engineers, all dedicated to the single purpose of making sure a particular sentence never reaches a particular pair of ears. Somewhere in a control room, technicians adjusted dials to make sure the interference matched the exact frequency of the incoming broadcast. In a strange, invisible tug of war fought entirely in the air above your house. And still, late at night or early in the morning, when the jamming crews were thinner, the signal sometimes slipped through anyway, thin and crackling, like a voice calling from very far away. You learned the good hours. You learned which frequencies tended to survive. It became a small private skill, passed from neighbor to neighbor in whispers. Try it after midnight. Try it just before the towers change shift. You switch the radio off before anyone else wakes, tuck it back under the pillow, and lie there for a moment turning over whatever fragments you managed to catch. A number here, a name there, a sentence about a country you'll never see. It's not much, but it's yours, and nobody gave it to you, and that in itself feels like something. The icon behind the wardrobe, downstairs, before breakfast. Your grandmother does something she has done every morning for as long as anyone can remember. She reaches behind the wardrobe, where a small wooden icon has been tucked out of sight, and touches it briefly, murmuring something under her breath. Then she slides it carefully back into its hiding place before anyone from outside the family might see. The state that governs your life is, by its own official declaration, an atheist state. Religion was labeled a leftover superstition from an older, less rational world, something a properly modern, scientific society was supposed to grow out of. Churches across the country were closed by the thousands over the decades. Some turned into warehouses, some into clubs, some into museums dedicated to explaining why religion was foolish, and some simply left to rot quietly in fields. Clergy who continued to serve openly could face real and serious consequences. Public religious practice, if you held any kind of official position or party membership, could quietly end a career. So belief didn't disappear. It just moved indoors, and then further indoors, tucked behind furniture, whispered rather than spoken, taught to children not in a classroom, but in a kitchen, in the same hushed tone you might use to share a family secret, because that is essentially what it had become. A baptism, something celebrated with bells and photographs in most of the world, might happen here in a distant village church where nobody recognized the family, arranged quietly through a trusted priest, timed carefully around anyone who might ask awkward questions later. Advancement in many careers came more smoothly to those who visibly embraced the official atheism, and a rumor of religious devotion could mark a person as unreliable, as not quite fully committed to the collective project. Your grandmother has lived her whole adult life inside this arrangement. She goes to work. She attends the required meetings. She nods along at the right moments. And every single morning, she touches a small piece of painted wood behind a wardrobe and keeps a part of herself that the state was never able to reach. There is something almost unbearably stubborn about that. A whole apparatus of government, an entire philosophy of history, all of it somehow unable to reach behind one wardrobe in one apartment. She closes the cupboard, wipes her hands on her apron, and calls everyone to breakfast as if nothing at all just happened. A second job in the shadows. Breakfast is bread, a boiled egg, and weak tea. And while you eat, your father mentions quietly that he'll be leaving a little early tonight, going by way of a friend's garage. Nobody asks too many questions because everybody already knows. Your father is an engineer at a state factory by day, and by evening, 2 or 3 times a week, he repairs private cars in a garage that officially doesn't exist, for cash that officially was never paid. This kind of moonlighting had its own quiet nickname among people who did it. A wink-and-nod term for unofficial after-hours work performed for private payment outside the state system entirely. In an economy where the official channels for getting your car fixed, your roof patched, your shoes resoled, or your radio repaired were slow, unreliable, and sometimes simply non-existent. An enormous, invisible economy of skilled people quietly filled the gap after their real jobs ended. A plumber from the state housing office, an electrician from the local factory, a seamstress from a state-run clothing plant. All of them, after clocking out from their official positions, clocked back in somewhere else entirely, working for themselves, for cash, for goods, for favors. The problem, from the state's point of view, was not the work itself. The work needed doing, and everybody quietly understood that. The problem was who was profiting and how. Labor that fell outside official channels, income that never touched a state ledger, skills rented out privately for private gain. All of it edged toward the same suspicious territory as speculation and private enterprise, the exact kind of independent economic activity the whole system was designed to prevent. If the scale grew too large, if a garage started looking less like a favor between neighbors and more like an actual business with regular customers and a price list, the consequences could escalate from a stern conversation to something considerably more serious. And yet almost everyone relied on this shadow economy at some point, whether they admitted it or not. The state provided the official world, gray, slow, and often empty-shelved. The shadow economy provided the world that actually worked, urgent and human, and completely unofficial. Your father laces up his work boots for his second, unlisted job, kisses your mother goodbye, and walks off toward a garage that exists everywhere and nowhere at once. The walk to school and the uniform of loyalty. You leave the apartment behind your father, satchel over one shoulder, and join the stream of children flowing toward the school at the end of the block. Around your neck, tied in a small triangular knot, is a red scarf. Every child your age wears one. It is not a fashion choice. It is a badge of membership in the state's official youth organization, and going without it, or wearing it carelessly, or losing it, was the kind of small infraction that could earn you a lecture in front of the entire class. The organization itself worked almost like a ladder. As a small child, you belonged to one tier, wearing a simple pin. A little older, you graduated into the scarf-wearing tier, with its own oaths and rituals, and a solemn little ceremony where you promised, hand raised, to live according to the principles of the revolution. Older still, and if your record was clean enough, you might be invited into the youth league proper, the one that mattered for university applications and future careers. Refusal to join at any stage was technically possible. Almost nobody actually refused. A child without the scarf stood out instantly in a classroom, and standing out was rarely a comfortable position to be in. Inside the classroom itself, the walls told their own story. A portrait of the current leader hung above the blackboard, flanked by slogans about labor, unity, and progress. Your history lessons were not really about disagreement or multiple perspectives. There was one correct interpretation of the past, one correct explanation for why the current system was the natural, inevitable, and best possible outcome of human history. And your job was to reproduce that explanation accurately on your exams. A teacher who wandered too far from the approved textbook, who allowed too much open debate about topics considered settled, could find themselves subject to review. And reviews of teachers were not gentle affairs. Even your compositions were watched with a kind of soft vigilance. An essay that leaned too personal, too questioning, too melancholic, might earn not just a poor grade, but a quiet note home, a suggestion that perhaps your family should keep a closer eye on what you were reading, who you were spending time with, what ideas seemed to be taking root. Teachers were, in their own way, part of the enormous informal surveillance system that ran underneath the official one, not necessarily out of malice, but because that is simply what the machinery of the system expected of them. And expectations in this particular country had a way of becoming obligations. You take your seat, recite the morning pledge along with 30 other children in perfect unison, and open your textbook to the chapter that will, once again, explain exactly how the world works and exactly where you fit inside it, the factory floor and the watching colleague. Meanwhile, across town, your uncle is already 3 hours into his shift at a machine tool factory, standing at a lathe that has not been meaningfully upgraded in over a decade. The factory floor is loud. The air smells of hot metal and machine oil, and above the noise, a loudspeaker occasionally crackles out updates on production quotas, exhortations to work harder, and on good days, praise for workers who exceeded their targets. Every workplace of any size had, somewhere in its structure, a political department whose job was less about production and more about loyalty. A political officer, sometimes formally trained, sometimes simply a trusted party member given the role, kept a watchful eye on the general mood of the workforce. Complaints about working conditions were tolerated within limits, filed as suggestions, occasionally even acted upon. Complaints that veered into criticism of the system itself, of the leadership, of the fundamental fairness of the arrangement, were an entirely different category, and workers learned quickly which category was safe and which was not. Part of what made this so exhausting was the sheer unpredictability of where the line actually sat. A joke about a shortage of spare parts might pass without comment on one day and earn a pointed question on another, depending entirely on who was listening and what mood the political department happened to be in that week. This unpredictability was not an accident of a poorly designed system. It was, in its own way, remarkably effective, because uncertainty about where exactly the line was made people police themselves far more thoroughly than any single rule ever could. You didn't need a guard standing over every worker if every worker had already learned to guard themselves. And yet, on the factory floor, in the brief moments between shifts, in the smoking area out back, a different kind of conversation happened too, hushed and quick, about the football match last weekend, about a rumor that a shipment of good boots had come into a shop 3 streets over, about whose cousin had managed to get a spot on a waiting list for a new apartment. Ordinary human life, stubbornly continuing underneath the loudspeaker announcements, and the watchful political officer, the same way it always does, everywhere, under every kind of government humanity has ever invented. The queue that ate the afternoon. By early afternoon, your mother has joined a line outside a shop that, according to rumor, passed along the courtyard that morning, might be receiving a delivery of good winter boots sometime today. Nobody quite knows when. Nobody quite knows how many pairs. The line simply forms, growing steadily longer as word spreads. Women and a few men standing patiently in the cold, breath fogging in the air, trading small talk and complaints in roughly equal measure. Queuing was not a minor inconvenience of daily life. It was, for many people, something closer to a part-time occupation. Goods appeared in shops unpredictably, without advance notice, and vanished again just as quickly once word got around. So an entire skill set developed around simply being present at the right place at the right moment. People kept mental maps of which shops tended to receive deliveries on which days. They developed friendships, specifically with shop workers who might, quietly, set aside an item under the counter for a regular customer. A practice built entirely on an unspoken web of small favors and mutual obligation that ran parallel to the official economy the whole way through. The line itself became its own strange social institution. Numbers were sometimes written on hands in pen so that people could briefly step away and hold their place. Arguments broke out over whether someone had actually been standing there the whole time or had simply wandered up and inserted themselves near the front. Elderly women, often retired and with more flexible schedules, sometimes made a modest habit of standing in line for goods they didn't personally need, then reselling their place, or the item itself once purchased, to someone further back who couldn't afford to wait. This, technically, brushed up against exactly the kind of profit through resale activity the law took a dim view of, though enforcement against an elderly woman selling her spot in a boot line was, in practice, rarely a priority for anyone. By the time your mother finally reaches the counter, 3 hours have passed, and the boots, as it turns out, have sold out just 2 customers ahead of her. She will try again tomorrow at a different shop, based on a different rumor, because this is simply how a household stayed clothed and equipped, one long patient afternoon at a time. Fashion, Flirtation, and the Fartsovshchik. By mid-afternoon, you meet your older cousin outside the metro station, and she is wearing something that immediately draws sideways glances from nearly everyone who passes. A real pair of imported sunglasses, the kind sold nowhere in any official shop, purchased 2 weeks earlier from a young man loitering near a tourist hotel downtown. She paid for them with a stack of rubles that represented nearly 2 weeks of her wages. And she wears them now with the quiet, defiant pride of someone who knows exactly how much they cost and doesn't care who's counting. The young men who dealt in goods like this operated in a very particular ecosystem, clustering near the hotels where foreign visitors stayed, near the airports, near anywhere tourists with hard currency and desirable belongings might pass through. Their trade covered far more than jeans and sunglasses. Chewing gum, cassette tapes, cosmetics, cigarette lighters, small transistor radios. Anything stamped with a foreign brand name carried an almost magical premium, regardless of its actual quality. A pack of Western chewing gum, worth pennies anywhere it was actually manufactured, could be traded here for a genuinely significant sum, simply because it was foreign, because it represented a world beyond the border that almost nobody in that line was ever going to see for themselves. These traders lived a double life balanced on a knife's edge. To their friends and family, many held ordinary day jobs, students or minor clerks or occasional hotel staff. Their real income and their real risk came after hours, trading in a legal gray zone that could, if the scale grew large enough, or if the wrong official happened to take notice, escalate into a formal charge of speculation or illegal currency dealing, carrying penalties that scaled sharply with the size of the operation. Small-time traders might face fines or a formal warning. Larger operations, especially ones that touched foreign currency directly rather than goods, risked the far harsher end of the law. And still, your cousin adjusts her new sunglasses in the reflection of a shop window, entirely unbothered, because in her mind the calculation is simple. The risk was real, but so was the 2 weeks of wages, and so was the way people looked at her now on the street. In a system that offered so few ways to express anything as small and human as individual taste, a pair of sunglasses purchased in a shadowed hotel doorway becomes something close to a statement of identity. The courtyard and the watching neighbor. You walk home together through the courtyard behind your apartment block, the same courtyard where most evenings an older woman named by everyone simply as the concierge sits near the entrance with her knitting, greeting residents as they pass. She seems, on the surface, like nothing more than a friendly fixture of the building, someone who has lived there longer than almost anyone else and knows everybody's business. In many apartment buildings across the country, a caretaker or building superintendent held an informal but very real responsibility for keeping track of who came and went, who had overnight guests, whose relatives were visiting from out of town, and whether anything about a household's routine had changed recently. Some of these caretakers held their positions specifically because they were trusted to report anything unusual to the appropriate local authorities. Others were simply naturally observant people whose gossip happened, on occasion, to travel further than intended. The distinction between an official informant and an ordinary nosy neighbor was often impossible to determine from the outside. And that uncertainty was, again, precisely the point. You didn't need every building to have a dedicated watcher if every resident quietly assumed that any building might. This created a particular kind of courtyard etiquette. Loud arguments were avoided, or at least muffled behind closed windows. Visitors who stayed unusually long, or who arrived and left at unusual hours, drew glances that residents had learned to read as a kind of silent warning. Even innocent activities, like a small gathering of friends playing guitar and singing on a warm evening, might be kept deliberately low-key, not because the songs themselves were illegal, but because an unfamiliar cluster of young people meeting regularly in one place had a way of attracting exactly the kind of attention nobody wanted. Your cousin waves cheerfully at the concierge as you pass, exactly as she does every day, because the safest response to potential surveillance was never suspicion or hostility. It was always warmth, normalcy, and the practiced appearance of having absolutely nothing whatsoever to hide. An evening rehearsal, quietly off script. That evening, you accompany your cousin to a rehearsal for an amateur theater group she belongs to, one of thousands of similar clubs that existed under the umbrella of official cultural organizations, sponsored by a local factory or trade union, meeting in a shared hall after work hours. On paper, these clubs existed to cultivate wholesome, ideologically sound cultural expression among ordinary workers. In practice, the actual content of what got performed depended enormously on the particular director, the particular local officials overseeing the group, and how closely anyone happened to be paying attention that season. Tonight's rehearsal is for a play that, strictly speaking, has not yet been formally approved by the cultural committee responsible for reviewing amateur productions before they could be performed for a public audience. The director, a schoolteacher by day with a genuine passion for theater, has taken a certain calculated risk, rehearsing scenes from a script that leans more personal, more ambiguous, and more emotionally complicated than the heroic, triumphant narratives officially favored. It is not a dissident work by any stretch. There are no direct political statements, no criticism of any specific policy, but its quiet, melancholic tone, its focus on private grief rather than collective triumph, sits slightly outside the approved emotional register, and everyone in the room understands, without anyone needing to say it aloud, that this particular script would need some careful softening before it could ever be shown to an actual audience, or else quietly abandoned altogether if the wrong person happened to sit in on a rehearsal. You watch from a folding chair near the back as your cousin runs through her lines, and there's something strangely moving about the scene. A small group of ordinary people, teachers and factory workers and students, gathering after a long day specifically to explore something a little more honest and complicated than what they were officially permitted to explore, quietly testing the edges of what the system would tolerate, one rehearsal at a time. The director calls a break, and for a few minutes, the conversation drifts to nothing more dangerous than which local shop might have coffee this week. Then the rehearsal resumes, careful and unhurried, as the evening outside slowly turns to dusk. Dinner and the art of saying nothing directly. By the time you and your cousin return home, the whole family has gathered around the small kitchen table for dinner. Boiled potatoes, a bit of sausage stretched carefully across 5 plates, dark bread, and a pot of tea steeping on the stove. Your grandfather, who fought in the war decades earlier, and carries a certain quiet authority in the household because of it, turns on the radio to catch the evening news. The official version, delivered in the calm, confident tone every citizen had learned to recognize instantly. The broadcast describes record grain harvests, a new dam completed ahead of schedule, and a message of solidarity from workers in a friendly neighboring country. Nobody at the table reacts with obvious skepticism. Nobody rolls their eyes or mutters a complaint. Instead, there's a kind of practiced, almost theatrical neutrality that settles over the room, faces arranged into pleasant blankness, because open disbelief, even among family, carried its own small risk. Children sometimes repeated things at school. In-laws sometimes gossiped. Even within 4 walls, full honesty required knowing exactly who was in the room and trusting every single one of them completely. Once the news ends and the radio moves on to music, the real conversation begins, still careful, but a little looser. Your grandfather mentions, in a roundabout way, that a friend of his from the war has been having difficulties lately. A euphemism everyone at the table understands without further explanation to mean that the friend has fallen under some kind of official scrutiny. For reasons nobody quite states out loud, possibly involving a relative who emigrated years ago, or a letter that was intercepted, or simply an unlucky rumor that reached the wrong ears. Your mother asks a single careful follow-up question, and your grandfather answers with a small shrug and a change of subject, because some topics were only ever discussed in fragments, never in full, even among the people you trusted most. This habit of communicating in half sentences, in meaningful pauses, in topics raised and then deliberately dropped, was one of the quiet skills every person in this country developed without ever being formally taught it. You learned to read a raised eyebrow the way you might read an entire paragraph. You learned which silences meant agreement, and which meant simply that the subject was too dangerous to finish. Entire family histories were passed down not in continuous stories, but in careful fragments, assembled slowly over years by children who learned to ask questions only when they were old enough to understand which answers needed to stay inside the house. Dinner ends. Plates are cleared. The radio hums on quietly in the background, playing approved, cheerful music, and for a little while, the kitchen feels almost entirely ordinary, almost entirely like any family kitchen anywhere in the world, which in its own way was exactly the point of getting through days like this one at all. The letter from abroad. Later that evening, your mother retrieves an envelope from a drawer. A letter that arrived 2 days earlier from a distant cousin who emigrated years before you were born and now lives on the other side of the world. The envelope, when it arrived, showed the faint but unmistakable signs of having been opened and resealed, a detail your mother noted silently and never mentioned to the mail carrier, because mentioning it would have accomplished nothing except drawing further attention to a piece of correspondence that was already, by its very existence, a small liability. Maintaining contact with relatives who had left the country was never explicitly, universally illegal in the way some of the offenses we've discussed tonight were. But it existed in a persistent gray zone, watched with quiet suspicion depending on the era, the family's existing reputation, and the general political climate at the time. A relative abroad was, in the eyes of a deeply cautious system, a potential channel for foreign ideas, for foreign currency, for foreign influence of exactly the kind the state spent so much effort trying to keep at bay. Letters were sometimes opened, sometimes copied, sometimes simply delayed for unexplained reasons, a subtle signal that someone, somewhere, was paying attention. Your mother reads the letter quietly at the kitchen table. A warm, ordinary update about a wedding, a new job, a photograph of a smiling child your family has never met in person. She reads it twice, memorizing a few small details to share later, and then folds it carefully back into its envelope. It will not be answered immediately. Replies were composed slowly, deliberately, worded with care, avoiding anything that could be misread as a request for help leaving, avoiding any hint of criticism toward life at home, sticking carefully to the safest, warmest, most unremarkable family news imaginable. Even love, even ordinary family affection reaching across a border, had to be filtered first through a kind of internal editor that every person in this position eventually developed, checking every sentence twice before it was allowed to leave the house. She tucks the letter back into its drawer, beside 2 or 3 others collected over the years, a small private archive of a relationship maintained despite the distance, despite the quiet surveillance, despite everything the system seemed designed to discourage. Family, it turns out, is remarkably difficult to legislate out of existence. No matter how many envelopes get opened along the way, a knock that wasn't for you, just as the dishes are being dried and put away. A sharp knock sounds at the door of the apartment down the hall, loud enough to carry through the thin walls of the building. Everyone in your kitchen goes quiet for a moment, an instinctive, practiced stillness before your mother glances at the clock and murmurs that it's probably just the water inspector, finally coming to check the pipes he was supposed to check last week. A moment later, muffled voices confirm she was right. It was nothing, and yet for that one brief moment, the entire kitchen held its breath. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something important about what daily life actually felt like for so many ordinary families across the decades. It wasn't that every knock at the door led to tragedy. For the overwhelming majority of people, on the overwhelming majority of evenings, a knock really was just a neighbor, a delivery, an inspector, nothing more. But the possibility, however statistically small on any given night, never fully disappeared from the back of anyone's mind, especially in families that still carried the memory of relatives or friends from earlier decades who had answered a knock and simply never come back the way they left. Your grandmother mentions, quietly and only once, a family 2 floors down whose father was taken for questioning some years back over accusations that were never fully explained to the neighbors, and who returned home nearly a year later, thinner, quieter, and unwilling to discuss where he had been or why. Nobody in the building ever asked him directly. It simply became one more thing everyone knew and nobody mentioned, folded into the unspoken map of the building's history, the same way everyone knew which neighbor to avoid discussing politics with, and which shop clerk might set aside a good cut of meat if you asked nicely. The tension eases as quickly as it arrived. Someone laughs quietly at how jumpy everyone got over a water pipe, and the evening continues. But that instinctive stillness, that fraction of a second, where an entire kitchen full of people braced themselves for something worse, is itself one of the most honest details of what it meant to live an ordinary life inside an extraordinary amount of quiet, low-grade uncertainty, day after day, for years that eventually stretched into decades. Winding down, and a song half remembered. As the evening finally settles, your father returns from his unofficial garage job, smelling faintly of engine grease, and the family gathers loosely in the main room. No particular plan in mind, beyond simply being together before bed. Your cousin hums a few bars of a foreign song she picked up secondhand, half from a smuggled cassette tape a friend played once at a gathering, half from a foreign broadcast someone managed to catch weeks earlier. She doesn't know all the words. Nobody in the room does. But the melody has traveled, mouth to mouth, memory to memory, all the way from a recording studio somewhere far beyond the border into this small kitchen, arriving not as a complete song, but as a fragment, hummed quietly by someone who will probably never hear the original version in full. There's something worth pausing on in that image. An entire apparatus of the state, jamming towers and customs inspections, and careful cultural committees, exists specifically to prevent music like this from arriving. And yet it arrives anyway, not as a record, not as a broadcast, but as something almost more resilient. A half-remembered tune carried in someone's head, reproduced imperfectly, passed along informally, impossible to confiscate because it exists nowhere except inside the people who remember it. You cannot search a house and find a melody. You cannot open an envelope and seize a half-remembered chorus. Culture, it turns out, moves through cracks far too narrow for any border guard to close. Your grandfather listens with a faint, knowing smile, neither approving nor disapproving out loud, and eventually suggests, gently, that it might be time for the younger ones to think about bed. Tomorrow is another workday, another school day, another day of careful lines and quiet caution stretching ahead exactly the way today did. Turning in, you brush your teeth in the shared bathroom down the hall, the water running cold as it usually does by this hour, and make your way to the small room you share with your cousin. Before turning off the light, she carefully slides her prized sunglasses into a drawer, tucking them beneath a folded scarf, out of sight of any casual visitor. It has become second nature to her. This instinct to keep certain small treasures just slightly hidden, not from fear exactly, but from the deeply ingrained habit of a life where a little discretion cost nothing and occasionally saved a great deal of trouble. Lying in the dark, you find yourself running back through the day. The muffled radio broadcast at dawn, your grandmother's small wooden icon behind the wardrobe, your father's second unofficial job, the long line for boots that ended in nothing, your cousin's imported sunglasses, and the young trader who sold them to her, the concierge in the courtyard, kind and watchful in equal measure, the theater rehearsal testing the edges of what was permitted, the letter from a relative on the other side of the world, read twice and folded carefully away, the knock at the door that turned out to be nothing at all. And now, finally, a half-remembered foreign song drifting quietly through a small apartment as the whole building settles down for the night. None of it, taken individually, seems like very much. A radio, a boot line, a pair of sunglasses, a letter, and yet stacked together, one ordinary moment after another, they form the quiet outline of an entire way of living, careful and constrained in 1,000 small ways, and still, somehow, full of exactly the same warmth, humor, love, and stubborn human persistence you would find in any kitchen, in any country, on any ordinary evening in history. A grandfather's war, remembered in fragments. You can't quite fall asleep yet, so you lie there in the dark a little longer, listening to the muffled sounds of the apartment settling for the night. And your mind drifts, as it sometimes does, to the stories your grandfather tells only occasionally, usually late in the evening, usually only when he's in a particular mood that can't be predicted or requested. He was a young man during the Second World War, part of the generation that endured one of the most devastating conflicts in human history on Soviet soil, a war that left tens of millions dead and entire cities reduced to rubble. The war occupies a strange, almost sacred position in the official culture of the country you live in. It is discussed constantly, commemorated extensively, woven into school curriculums and public monuments and annual parades. One of the very few subjects where the official narrative and genuine, widely shared personal grief overlap almost completely. Nearly every family lost someone. Nearly every family has a story. And yet even here, in a subject the state actively encouraged people to discuss, there were still edges, still careful omissions. Your grandfather sometimes mentions, quietly and briefly, the chaos and confusion of the war's earliest months, when leadership decisions were sometimes questionable, and casualties mounted partly because of miscalculation rather than purely because of enemy strength. These particular details, the ones that reflect less flatteringly on the decisions made at the very top, were not the kind of thing found in the official textbooks, which tended to present the war as an unbroken narrative of heroic resistance and inevitable righteous victory. Your grandfather doesn't dwell on the difficult parts for long. He mentions them briefly, almost in passing, and then moves back to safer territory. A friend from his unit, a small act of kindness between soldiers, a joke that kept morale up during a long, cold winter at the front. There's a particular kind of storytelling that develops in a household like yours, shaped by decades of learning exactly how much truth could be spoken safely, and exactly how much needed to stay folded away, even in memory, even in stories told only to family. Your grandfather is not lying when he tells his stories. He's simply exercising the same careful editorial instinct that shapes every conversation in this house, deciding, sentence by sentence, how much of the full picture a given moment can safely hold. The neighbor who disappeared for a while. Your thoughts drift, as they sometimes do at this hour, to a name you've heard mentioned only a handful of times over the years. A family friend, a colleague of your grandfather's from decades ago, a man whose name comes up rarely and always briefly. From the fragments you've pieced together over the years, this man held a modest position in a local administrative office and was, by all accounts, an ordinary, unremarkable person, until one year he simply wasn't there anymore. He was gone for a long stretch, years by some accounts, and when he eventually returned, he was different. Quieter, thinner, reluctant to discuss anything about where he had been. Nobody in your family ever learned the full details. And this itself tells you something important about how information moved, or failed to move, through ordinary life. Official explanations, when they existed at all, tended to be vague, bureaucratic, and unsatisfying, citing administrative matters or reassignments rather than anything specific. Families of people who were detained or sent away for extended periods often received little real information, and asking too many questions through official channels sometimes drew unwanted attention to the person doing the asking, rather than any actual answers about the person who had disappeared. This created, over the decades, an entire unofficial culture of half-known histories. Nearly every extended family, nearly every apartment building, nearly every workplace carried at least one story like this. A person who vanished for a stretch and returned changed, or who never returned at all, remembered only in careful, incomplete fragments passed down at exactly the volume and exactly the level of detail that felt safe. Children grew up absorbing these fragments the way you absorb the shape of furniture in a dark room, sensing the outline of something significant without ever being shown the whole thing directly. Your grandfather never speaks the man's full story in one sitting. It comes out instead across years, a sentence here during one conversation, another detail there during a different one entirely, until eventually, much later in your life, you might finally assemble enough fragments to understand roughly what happened. This was, in its own quiet way, one more skill an entire generation learned without ever being taught it formally. How to tell a true story slowly enough and carefully enough that it never became dangerous to anyone in the room. What the state wanted from you and what it actually got, lying there in the dark, turning all of this over. It's worth pausing to think about what the system, at its core, was actually trying to accomplish with all these rules, all this quiet surveillance, all these small and large offenses scattered across a single, ordinary day. The stated goal, repeated constantly in official language, was unity. A society moving forward together, free of the selfishness, inequality, and chaos its founders believed defined the world before it. Individual ambition, individual profit, individual expression outside approved channels. All of it was seen as a threat to that unity, a crack through which the old selfish world might come creeping back in. And yet, what actually developed across decades of trying to eliminate exactly those individual impulses, was something far messier and far more human than any planning committee could have designed. People still fell in love with forbidden pairs of jeans and forbidden songs. People still found ways to make a little extra money on the side, to speak honestly in the rooms where it felt safe, to hold onto private faith, private grief, private joy. All the small individual textures of a life that no ideology, however comprehensive, could ever fully absorb into something purely collective. The system did not fail to change people. It changed them enormously, shaping how they spoke, what they were willing to say out loud, how they organized their friendships and their trust. But it never managed to erase the underlying impulse toward individual life entirely. And perhaps it never could have, because that impulse seems to be something close to a permanent feature of being human, showing up again and again in every system history has ever produced. No matter how thoroughly that system tried to plan it away. Your eyes are heavy now. The apartment has gone fully quiet. Just the faint tick of a clock somewhere in the main room, and the distant, occasional rumble of a truck passing on the street below. Whatever tomorrow holds, it will likely look very much like today. Another small collection of ordinary moments, most of them entirely unremarkable, a few of them brushing quietly up against rules you didn't ask for and can't fully control. All of it carried forward by people who, whatever else may be true about the world they were born into, continue simply to live, as people everywhere always eventually find a way to do. The communal apartment, 2 floors below. Before sleep finally takes you, your mind wanders 1 floor down and 1 building over to your aunt's building, where she still lives in what is known as a communal apartment, a single large flat originally built for 1 family generations ago, and now divided among 3 separate households who share a kitchen, a bathroom, and a hallway, but nothing else. This arrangement, once extremely widespread across the country's larger cities, emerged from decades of severe housing shortages. As cities swelled with people arriving for factory work, while construction of new apartments never quite managed to keep pace with demand. Living in a communal flat meant a particular kind of intimacy with strangers that most people elsewhere in the world rarely experience. Your aunt shares her kitchen with a retired schoolteacher in his 70s and a young couple with a newborn, and the daily choreography of cooking, bathing, and simply existing in shared space required an elaborate, unspoken etiquette. A cooking schedule, informally agreed upon, dictated roughly which hours belonged to which family. A chart near the bathroom door, hand-drawn and slightly yellowed with age, tracked whose turn it was to clean the shared spaces that week. Disagreements over noise, over borrowed sugar never returned, over a delivery left too long in the shared hallway, could simmer for months, sometimes years, in ways that turned entire households into reluctant experts in the art of passive-aggressive notes left on the kitchen table. And yet, communal living also produced its own particular warmth. The retired teacher, lonely since his wife passed away, has become something like an unofficial grandfather to the young couple's newborn, minding the baby for an hour here and there while the parents run errands. Your aunt trades small favors constantly with her flatmates. A watchful eye on a simmering pot while she steps out. A spare needle and thread borrowed on a Sunday evening. News and gossip exchanged over the shared stove that often traveled faster and more reliably through the building than anything printed in an official newspaper. The deeper tension in communal living, though, was the near total absence of privacy. And privacy, or the lack of it, mattered enormously in a system already so attentive to what its citizens said and did behind closed doors. A private apartment with its own single locked door and no shared hallway full of curious neighbors was a genuine luxury, something families spent years, sometimes decades, on waiting lists to obtain. Until then, an argument between spouses, a visit from a relative, a hushed late-night conversation. All of it happened within earshot of people who were, technically, strangers, sharing walls thin enough that entire households learned to speak in lowered voices as a simple matter of daily habit, regardless of what they were actually discussing. A visit to the clinic. Earlier that same week, your aunt had taken her young niece to the local outpatient clinic for a routine checkup, an errand that on paper should have been simple. Healthcare across the country was, in official terms, free and universal, available to every citizen without direct payment at the point of care. A genuine point of pride, repeated often in official messaging. And in fairness, a real achievement in terms of basic access compared to many other parts of the world at the time. Vaccination campaigns reached deep into rural areas. Basic care, in theory, was available to everyone regardless of income, but the practical experience of accessing that care told a more complicated story. The clinic itself was overcrowded, chronically understaffed, and equipped with instruments and medicines that were frequently outdated or simply unavailable when needed most. Waiting rooms filled early in the morning with patients who had learned, through hard experience, that arriving late meant potentially waiting the entire day without being seen. Doctors, themselves underpaid and overworked, developed their own quiet, unofficial systems for prioritizing patients, and a small gift, a box of good chocolate, a bottle of decent cognac, a favor owed and repaid, could sometimes make the difference between a rushed 5-minute appointment and a doctor willing to actually examine a complicated symptom carefully. This informal gift-giving culture around medical care existed in an uneasy space, never quite officially sanctioned, never quite treated as outright bribery either, more a kind of unspoken tradition that everyone participated in and nobody discussed too openly. A doctor who demanded payment outright risked serious professional consequences. A doctor who simply happened to receive small tokens of gratitude from patients who valued the extra attention occupied a much safer gray zone. And most families, your aunt included, kept a small mental list of what a particular specialist tended to appreciate, updated through word of mouth among friends and relatives who had navigated the same system before. Certain categories of medicine, particularly newer treatments, or anything imported from beyond the border, were desperately scarce, reserved often for hospitals treating high-ranking officials, or simply unavailable through ordinary channels altogether. Families with a relative who happened to work in a pharmacy, or who knew someone who traveled abroad occasionally, held a quiet, valuable kind of social capital. One more thread in the enormous invisible web of favors and connections that ran underneath the official structure of daily life, filling in the gaps the formal system left behind. 2 years that belonged to the state. Your older cousin's husband, a quiet, serious young man named Victor, spent 2 years of his early 20s away from home entirely, fulfilling a period of mandatory military service that every young man of a certain age was required to complete, barring specific exemptions for health conditions or particular educational paths. This wasn't a choice. It was, quite simply, an obligation woven into what it meant to become an adult man in this country, treated with the same inevitability as paying taxes or registering your residence. Life during those 2 years followed a rhythm almost entirely outside Victor's own control. Where he was stationed, what unit he served in, how close or far from home he ended up, all of it was decided by assignment rather than preference. Letters home were subject to review, meaning soldiers, like everyone else in this story tonight, learned quickly to write carefully, sticking to safe, reassuring, unremarkable details about daily routine, rather than anything resembling genuine complaint about conditions, however difficult those conditions sometimes were. Barracks life itself carried its own unofficial hierarchy, layered on top of the official military rank structure, in which older, more senior conscripts held informal authority over newer arrivals, a system that varied enormously in severity depending on the particular unit and the particular commanding officers involved, sometimes amounting to little more than good-natured hazing, and sometimes escalating into something considerably harsher. Families back home worried constantly, but learned to read between the careful lines of infrequent letters, watching for the particular tone that might indicate genuine trouble beneath the reassuring surface details. When Victor finally returned, 2 years older and considerably quieter than the young man who left, he rarely spoke in detail about his service, offering instead the same kind of careful, fragmentary storytelling you'd already come to recognize from your grandfather's war stories. A funny anecdote here, a brief mention of a good friend made during those 2 years, and long silences around anything that touched on the parts that were harder to discuss. Military service, like so much else in this story, was something everyone around you had either lived through directly or lived alongside as a worried relative. And yet somehow it remained a topic discussed only in careful outline, never in full. The long road to a university seat, somewhere in the back of your mind, as sleep keeps circling, but never quite arriving. You think about your cousin's daughter, 17 now, spending nearly every evening this year buried in exam preparation books, working toward the entrance examinations that will determine, more than almost anything else in her life, what kind of future she'll be permitted to build. University admission in this system operated through a demanding, centrally organized examination process, and the stakes attached to performing well were enormous, because higher education here functioned as one of the very few reliable pathways toward a genuinely comfortable life, better housing, better pay, and greater freedom in choosing where you eventually worked. The competition for the most prestigious institutions, particularly in the largest cities, was fierce, almost beyond imagination, with vastly more qualified applicants than available seats every single year. Preparation for these examinations often began years in advance, sometimes with private tutors hired quietly and paid for under the table, a practice that existed in its own familiar gray zone, technically outside the formal education system, but tolerated in the same unofficial way as so much else in daily life. Families who could arrange this kind of extra help for their children, often through personal connections rather than any advertised service, gave their children a meaningful advantage. One more small crack in the supposedly equal classless system, where equality was, in practice, always a little more equal for some families than others, beyond raw academic merit. Admission committees also weighed a student's social background carefully, examining not just test scores, but also a candidate's family history, their record of participation in official youth organizations, and any notable political blemishes attached to their household. A relative who had fallen under suspicion years earlier, a family member who had emigrated, or even distant ties to people considered politically unreliable, could quietly work against a young applicant's chances, regardless of how strong their actual exam performance had been. Meanwhile, being the child of a factory worker or a collective farmer carried a particular kind of favorable weight in the official ideology, at least on paper, reflecting the state's stated preference for advancing students from the working classes, rather than what it viewed as an emerging, suspect, educated elite, reproducing its own privileged generation after generation. Your cousin's daughter, for her part, worries about none of this in any conscious, articulated way. She simply studies, late into the night, driven by the same universal teenage anxiety about the future that exists in every country and every era, unaware, in the way 17-year-olds often are, of just how many invisible forces beyond her control were quietly shaping the odds she was up against. A sanatorium by the sea. If you were lucky, your thoughts drift toward summer, still months away, and the annual question of vacation that occupies so much quiet planning in households like yours. Paid vacation time was a genuine, guaranteed feature of employment here. Another point of real pride in the official system, and workers across the country dreamed all year of the 2 or 3 weeks they might spend away from the grinding routine of factory floors and crowded apartments. The most coveted destination for that vacation time was a stay at a sanatorium, a kind of state-run health resort, often located somewhere scenic along a southern coastline, offering rest, mild medical treatments, and a temporary escape from the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Access to these sanatoriums, however, was not simply a matter of booking a room. Vouchers for the best facilities were distributed through workplaces, often through the trade union attached to a particular factory or institution. And the allocation process was, like so much else, layered with informal hierarchies. A model worker who consistently exceeded production targets, a loyal and long-serving union member, or simply someone with the right personal connections in the union office, stood a much better chance of receiving a voucher to one of the truly desirable coastal resorts, while everyone else competed for whatever remained, often facilities considerably less impressive, located somewhere far less scenic, or simply unavailable that particular year. For those who did manage to secure a good voucher, the sanatorium experience itself followed a fairly rigid, almost medicinal daily schedule, with prescribed meal times, mandatory rest periods, organized group activities, and a general institutional atmosphere that some visitors found genuinely restorative, and others found faintly exhausting in its own regimented way. Meals were served at fixed hours in a shared dining hall. Doctors on staff conducted brief checkups and prescribed mild treatments, mineral baths, controlled sun exposure, gentle exercise regimens, all according to whatever ailment or general fatigue a worker happened to be recovering from. Evening entertainment, when offered, tended toward approved, wholesome programming. Folk music performances, film screenings of officially sanctioned movies, occasional lectures on topics deemed suitably improving. For most families, though, and yours among them, an actual sanatorium stay remained an occasional treat rather than a yearly guarantee. And vacation more commonly meant something considerably simpler, a train journey to visit relatives in a smaller town or village, or a modest stay at a family dacha, a small countryside cottage many urban families maintained on a small plot of land just outside the city, where the real vacation activity involved growing vegetables, picking mushrooms in nearby forests, and simply enjoying a change of air away from the crowded apartment blocks of the city. These small countryside plots, technically similar to the private garden plots we discussed earlier in this story represented one more quiet space where families could exercise a small, treasured measure of control over their own lives, growing what they chose, working at their own pace, answerable to no factory floor supervisor and no political officer, if only for a precious few weeks each summer. The grandmother who remembered before. There is one more figure worth pausing on tonight. A great aunt on your mother's side, older even than your grandmother, old enough to remember, in fragments passed down carefully over the years. A version of the country that existed before the current system took shape at all. She rarely speaks of those earlier years in any detail, and what little she has shared came out slowly, over many years, in the same careful, fragmentary way so much difficult family history seemed to surface in this household. From what your mother has pieced together over the decades, your great-aunt's own family had once run a modest, small business. Nothing grand, simply a small shop passed down through a couple of generations. The kind of ordinary family enterprise that existed everywhere in the world before the revolution reorganized the entire economic structure of the country from the ground up. In the sweeping transformations of those early revolutionary years, small private businesses, like the one your family once owned, were absorbed entirely into the new collective system. Their owners reclassified overnight from modest shopkeepers into a suspect social category, regarded with lingering official distrust for years afterward, simply because of what their family had once, briefly, owned. This kind of family history, a distant relative's shop, a grandparent's uncomfortable social classification decades earlier, tended to follow families quietly through generations, resurfacing in small, unexpected ways. A university application scrutinized a little more carefully. A promotion that somehow always seemed to go to someone else. A background check for a particular job that took a little longer to clear than anyone expected. Your great-aunt learned, very early in her life, to speak as little as possible about her family's earlier circumstances, a habit she carried with her for the rest of her life. Long after the most severe periods of suspicion toward families like hers had softened considerably, she sits, most evenings now, in a comfortable chair by her window. A woman who has lived through revolution, war, famine years, and decades of quiet, careful survival. And when she does occasionally share a fragment of her earlier life, everyone around her listens closely, aware without needing to say so that they are hearing something rare. A small, precious piece of a version of history that exists almost nowhere in official records, preserved only in the quiet, careful memory of the very last people who actually lived it. A village far from the city and the collective field. Your mind wanders now further out from the city toward the small village where your grandmother's brother still lives and works, tending land that technically belongs not to him, but to the collective farm his entire community was folded into decades earlier. This particular transformation, the reorganization of countryside life into large collective and state-run farms ranks among the most sweeping, and, in its earliest years, most devastating changes the system ever imposed on ordinary people, and its consequences shaped rural life for generations afterward. In the decades before your great-uncle was even born, independent farming families across the countryside were pressured, often with considerable and sometimes brutal force, to give up their individual land holdings, their livestock, and their equipment, merging everything into large collective enterprises theoretically owned and managed jointly by the community, but in practice directed almost entirely by state planning targets set far away in distant offices. Families who resisted this reorganization, particularly wealthier peasant households who had more land and livestock to lose, were frequently labeled with a specific derogatory term marking them as class enemies. And the consequences for these families ranged from confiscation of their property to forced relocation to, in the harshest periods, deportation to remote regions under conditions that claimed a great many lives. The famine that struck significant parts of the countryside in the early 1930s connected closely to the chaos and mismanagement of this reorganization, combined with punishing grain requisition quotas, remains one of the darkest chapters in the entire story. A catastrophe that claimed millions of lives and left scars on rural communities that persisted for the rest of the century. By the time your great-uncle came of age, decades later, this collectivized system had become simply the unquestioned, permanent structure of rural life, the only version of agriculture he or anyone his age had ever personally known. He works now on a large collective farm, rising before dawn to tend to his assigned section of crops or livestock, following a work schedule and set of production quotas determined by planners who had never once visited the actual fields they were making decisions about. Payment for collective farm labor historically lagged well behind wages available in the cities, and for many years, workers on these farms operated under separate, more restrictive rules governing internal travel, making it considerably harder for a rural resident to simply relocate to a city in search of better opportunities compared to residents who were already registered as urban dwellers. And yet, exactly as we discussed earlier in this story with the small private garden plots, your great-uncle's household maintains its own modest private plot alongside the collective land, a small patch where the produce belongs entirely to his own family, to eat or to sell at the local market within the carefully bounded limits the law allowed. It is, in miniature, the same quiet contradiction that runs through so much of this entire system. An economy built on the promise of pure collective ownership, propped up in no small part by the stubborn, more productive efforts people put into the tiny patches of land they were allowed to call, in some limited but very real sense, their own. what was allowed on the screen. Back in the city, your younger brother has been begging all week to see a new film playing at the local cinema. And this weekend, finally, your parents agree to take him. Cinema held an enormous, genuinely beloved place in ordinary cultural life, offering an affordable, popular escape from the daily grind. And the state understood perfectly well the power of film as both entertainment and as a tool for shaping public sentiment, which meant that everything reaching a movie screen passed first through layers of careful review. A script had to clear approval before filming even began, checked for ideological soundness, for appropriate messaging, for the careful absence of anything that might be read as criticism of the system or excessive sympathy toward ideas the state preferred citizens not dwell on. Once filming wrapped, the finished picture faced further review before distribution, and directors whose work strayed too far from acceptable boundaries could find their films shelved indefinitely. Sometimes for years, sometimes permanently, screened only decades later, once the political climate had shifted enough to allow it. Some of the most celebrated filmmakers of the era spent years navigating an exhausting, delicate balancing act, learning precisely how much artistic ambiguity, how much genuine complexity of character, how much subtle critique could be woven into a film without triggering the kind of official concern that would see the finished work quietly buried in a storage vault rather than released to actual audiences. For ordinary moviegoers like your family, though, this entire process of negotiation and compromise happened invisibly, somewhere far upstream of the finished product, flickering on the screen in front of them. What audiences actually experienced was simply an evening at the cinema, a comedy or an adventure story or a war drama. Tickets affordable enough that a family outing like this one remained well within reach, even for households of fairly modest means. Popular genres included grand historical epics, celebrating pivotal moments in the nation's past, war films honoring the enormous sacrifices of the recent global conflict, and lighter comedies that, while still ultimately affirming approved values by the final reel, offered a genuinely enjoyable couple of hours of humor and warmth. Your brother emerges from tonight's film thoroughly delighted, chattering the whole walk home about his favorite scene, utterly unaware of the careful, invisible negotiations that shaped every frame he just watched, which is, in its own way, exactly how the system wanted the whole experience to feel. Seamless, enjoyable, and entirely uncomplicated for the audience sitting in the dark, popcorn in hand, simply there for a good story, preparing for the coldest holiday of the year. As winter approaches in your memory of this particular year, the household begins its slow, familiar preparation for the New Year holiday. The secular celebration we touched on earlier tonight, the one that inherited the decorated tree and the gift-giving traditions once associated with Christmas, repackaged carefully under new, ideologically acceptable branding. By this point in your family's life, the holiday feels entirely natural, entirely unremarkable. The single most anticipated and beloved occasion of the entire year, regardless of its complicated earlier history. Preparation involves its own particular set of challenges, familiar by now to anyone who has been listening to this story unfold tonight. Certain treasured holiday foods, particular fruits, good chocolate, specific delicacies traditionally associated with the celebration, tend to appear in shops only briefly in the weeks leading up to the holiday, triggering exactly the kind of urgent, opportunistic shopping and quiet hoarding we discussed earlier. As families rush to secure what they can, the moment word spreads that a shipment has arrived somewhere nearby. Your mother has, over the years, developed her own careful network of contacts. A friend at one shop who might set aside good oranges. A cousin's connection at a bakery who can occasionally provide a slightly better cake than what's generally available. All part of that same enormous invisible web of favors that quietly keeps households functioning throughout the year, called upon with extra urgency this time of season. On the holiday itself, the tree goes up in the main room, decorated with ornaments passed down through the family for years, topped, as tradition dictates, with a bright star rather than anything resembling its earlier religious symbolism. Presents, modest by the standards of some other parts of the world, but treasured all the more for their relative scarcity, are exchanged the following morning, and the extended family gathers for a meal that represents, in many households, the single most generous spread of food the whole year will see. Every small delicacy secured over weeks of careful planning, finally laid out together on the table at once. There's something genuinely moving in watching a holiday travel this particular journey. Banned outright in the system's earliest, most ideologically rigid years, then carefully rehabilitated and repackaged once officials recognized how much genuine joy and tradition they'd be destroying by insisting on its permanent removal. And finally, by your own generation, so completely normalized that almost nobody pauses to consider its strange political origin story at all. It becomes, simply, the warmest night of the year. Candles and pine needles, and the particular happy exhaustion of children who stayed up far too late. Exactly the same feeling families everywhere in the world associate with their own winter celebrations, regardless of what particular history shaped the specific traditions involved. Your mother's double shift, somewhere between sleep and wakefulness now. Your thoughts settle on your mother, who works full days at a textile factory across town, and then comes home to what amounted to an entirely second job. Cooking, cleaning, managing the household's endless small logistics, all without any of it counting officially as labor in the way her factory shift did. This arrangement, women working full-time in the official economy, while also carrying nearly the entire weight of housework and childcare was one of the great unspoken contradictions of the whole system, and it shaped the daily reality of women's lives across the entire country in ways the official messaging rarely acknowledged honestly. The state's own propaganda took genuine pride in the near-universal participation of women in the workforce, presenting it as one of the clearest markers of the system's commitment to equality. A stark contrast, official messaging often emphasized, with societies elsewhere where women's work remained more restricted. And in certain measurable ways, this pride was not unfounded. Women worked in enormous numbers as doctors, engineers, factory supervisors, and skilled tradespeople, occupying professional roles that remained considerably rarer for women in many other parts of the world during the same decades. Access to these professions was broad. Education was free and open to women on largely equal terms, and a woman with ambition and ability had, by the standards of the era, a genuinely wide range of paths available to her. But the promise of equality stopped rather abruptly at the front door of the family apartment. Domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, laundry, the endless daily work of simply keeping a household functioning remained overwhelmingly the responsibility of women, layered on top of a full workday already spent at a factory or an office, with remarkably little cultural expectation that husbands would meaningfully share this second, unpaid shift. Add to this the additional burden created by the very shortages and inefficiencies we've discussed throughout tonight's story. The hours spent standing in unpredictable lines, the constant informal networking required just to keep a kitchen stocked, and women across the country found themselves carrying an almost unimaginable daily workload, praised constantly by official messaging for their contribution to the workforce, while receiving comparatively little practical relief at home. For the second full workday waiting for them there every single evening, your mother rarely complains about any of this directly, not because she doesn't feel the exhaustion of it, but because complaint, as we've discussed so many times tonight, required careful calibration about audience and consequence, and a general grievance about the unequal division of household labor, however real and however widely shared among women across the entire country, simply wasn't the kind of thing that got voiced loudly in public. Instead, it surfaced the way so much honest feeling did in this household. In a tired sigh late in the evening, in a quiet joke shared with a close friend, in the particular exhausted quality of her movements as she finally sits down, hours after her official workday technically ended, to fold the last of the evening's laundry before bed. A wedding and the paperwork of love, your thoughts drift further to your older cousin's wedding 2 summers ago, an occasion that, like nearly everything else in this story, combined genuine warmth and celebration with its own quiet layer of bureaucratic negotiation running underneath. Marriage itself required registration through a state civil registry office, a process considerably more administrative and considerably less ceremonial than wedding traditions in many other parts of the world. Though most couples still found ways to layer genuine celebration, family gatherings, favorite foods, music, and dancing around the comparatively brief official registration itself. Housing, as we've already discussed at length tonight, remained one of the most persistent and stressful practical challenges facing any newly married couple. A young couple could not simply decide to find an apartment together the way couples in many other countries might. Available housing was allocated through waiting lists tied to workplaces, family size, and existing housing conditions. And the wait for a couple's own independent apartment could stretch on for years, sometimes many years, during which newlyweds frequently continued living with one set of parents, an arrangement that added its own particular strain to the early years of married life. 3 generations sometimes crowded into a space originally intended for far fewer people. This housing pressure, combined with the earlier point we touched on regarding the residence permit system, occasionally shaped marriage decisions in ways that had little to do with romance at all. A marriage to someone already holding a coveted residence permit for a major city, for instance, could offer a genuine, practical pathway toward a better registered address. And while nobody ever spoke about this calculation openly or admitted to it as a primary motivation, everyone in this story tonight understands, without needing it explained further, that practical considerations like housing and registration, status, quietly shaped countless real relationships and marriage decisions across the country, threading alongside genuine affection in ways that were never fully separable from each other. Your cousin's own marriage, by every account you've ever heard, was built on entirely genuine affection. 2 people who had known each other since childhood and grown steadily closer over years of shared friendship before any formal courtship began. And yet even a marriage built on real love still had to navigate the same practical bureaucratic maze as everyone else. The waiting lists, the paperwork, the careful negotiation with both sets of parents about where the young couple would actually live in the meantime. All the ordinary, unglamorous administrative texture that sat quietly underneath even the happiest and most sincere occasions this particular society had to offer. Divorce and the social weight of an unofficial word. Not every marriage in your extended circle of family and friends ended happily, and your thoughts turn briefly before finally drifting toward sleep to a family friend who went through a difficult divorce a few years back, an experience that revealed its own particular set of social and bureaucratic pressures, layered on top of the ordinary emotional difficulty divorce carries anywhere in the world. Divorce itself was legal and available, though the ease of obtaining one shifted considerably across different decades, with certain periods imposing deliberately steep fees and cumbersome procedural requirements, specifically intended to discourage couples from separating too readily, reflecting the state's broader interest in stable family units as a foundation for a stable society. Beyond the formal legal process, divorce carried its own social weight, particularly for anyone holding a position of any visibility, party membership, a managerial role, a public-facing job. A divorce, especially one that appeared at all scandalous, or that suggested instability or poor personal judgment, could quietly work against a person's professional advancement, discussed in exactly the same hushed, careful, consequence-aware tone that shaded so many other supposedly private matters throughout this entire story. Workplace committees sometimes formally weighed in on personal conduct matters, including marital difficulties, treating what most of the world considers an entirely private matter as something touching, at least tangentially, on a person's broader reliability and moral standing as a citizen. For your family's friend, the divorce ultimately went through without any truly severe professional consequences, though she has mentioned, in the same careful, understated way so many people in this story discuss difficult chapters of their lives, that certain colleagues grew noticeably cooler toward her for a stretch afterward, and a promotion she had been quietly expecting around that same time never quite materialized. Its absence never explained directly, but understood by everyone involved as connected, at least in part, to timing that simply happened to be unfortunate. She rebuilt her life steadily in the years that followed, eventually remarrying, and today speaks of that difficult period with the same measured, forward-looking resilience you've encountered again and again tonight in nearly everyone this story has introduced you to. People who absorbed whatever difficulty the system placed in front of them, adjusted as best they could, and simply kept moving forward, because the alternative, dwelling endlessly on what couldn't be changed, was a luxury very few people in this particular time and place felt they could genuinely afford. Growing old on a fixed and modest sum, your thoughts settle now on your great-grandmother, who lives in a small room in your grandmother's apartment, having moved in years ago. Once managing her own household alone became too difficult. She receives a modest state pension each month, another one of the system's genuine, guaranteed social provisions, available to every citizen who reached retirement age after a career of recognized labor. And in its own way, this guarantee represented real security, a promise that nobody would simply be abandoned entirely in old age, regardless of their circumstances. The practical reality of living on that pension, though, told a more complicated story than the guarantee alone suggested. The monthly sum was calculated according to formulas tied to a person's work history, their final salary level, and the particular category of labor they had performed, meaning pensions varied considerably, with certain favored categories of work: heavy industrial labor, military service, particular scientific or academic careers, generating noticeably more generous pensions than others. For an elderly woman like your great-grandmother, whose working life had been spent mostly in less prestigious clerical roles, the resulting pension covered basic necessities, but left very little room for anything beyond them, making her, in practice, dependent on the broader extended family support to maintain any real comfort in her final years. This dependency shaped daily life in your household in ways so routine you'd almost stopped noticing them. Your great-grandmother's modest pension check arrived monthly and was folded, without much discussion, into the family's shared household budget, treated as one small contributing stream among several, rather than a truly independent source of support. In turn, she contributed what she could in other ways, minding you and your siblings after school before your parents finished their own workdays, mending clothes with the careful, practiced skill of a woman who had spent an entire lifetime making limited resources stretch as far as they possibly could, sharing her own ration of patience and stories with grandchildren who, exactly as we discussed earlier tonight, absorbed fragments of an older, half-remembered version of the country's history simply by spending quiet afternoons in her company. There's a particular kind of quiet dignity in how she carries this arrangement, neither resentful of her dependency nor falsely cheerful about it, simply matter-of-fact in the way. An entire generation that lived through war, famine, and decades of scarcity had learned to be matter-of-fact about nearly everything. She often remarks, when the subject of her modest pension comes up at all, that she has seen far harder years than these, and that a warm room, a full stomach, and grandchildren nearby represent, by the measure of what she once knew, something close to genuine abundance. The pride and the pressure of the Olympic Stadium. Later that same week, your family gathers around the television to watch a broadcast of an international sporting competition, and the entire mood in the room shifts noticeably, growing louder, more animated, more openly emotional than nearly any other moment we've witnessed together tonight. Sport occupied an absolutely enormous place in the national imagination, treated by the state as one of the clearest, most visible arenas in which the entire system's success or failure could be measured directly against the rest of the world. Medal count against medal count, record against record, in a way that felt, to ordinary citizens watching at home, refreshingly uncomplicated compared to the careful ambiguity that shaded almost every other part of daily life. Talented young athletes were identified early, often as children, and funneled into an extensive, well-resourced system of specialized sports schools, training programs, and coaching staff, all supported directly by the state, reflecting genuine, serious national investment in athletic achievement as a matter of both cultural pride and geopolitical prestige. This investment produced real, extraordinary results across decades of international competition. Athletes and teams that dominated numerous sports on the world stage. And each victory was celebrated at home, not merely as an individual or team achievement, but as a validation of the entire system, proof, broadcast repeatedly and enthusiastically, that the whole structure of society was capable of producing excellence the rest of the world could not match. For the athletes themselves, though the pressure attached to this national symbolism could be immense. Success brought genuine rewards, comfortable housing, travel opportunities considerably broader than those available to ordinary citizens, a measure of fame and respect. Failure, or even simply underperformance relative to expectations, could bring consequences considerably harsher than disappointment alone, threatening an athlete's career, their access to those hard-won privileges, and occasionally their broader standing within the system more generally. Training regimens for elite athletes were demanding to a degree that, viewed from outside, sometimes bordered on genuinely severe, particularly for children identified young and placed into specialized boarding schools far from their families, specifically to develop athletic talent the state had already decided was worth the investment. Your younger brother, for his part, understands none of this deeper complexity as he cheers loudly for the national team from his spot on the living room floor, caught up entirely in the simple, uncomplicated joy of watching his country win. A joy that, whatever its more complicated undercurrents, remains one of the most genuine and widely shared emotional experiences this entire system managed to produce, uniting a household otherwise so carefully attentive to nuance and caution in nearly everything else into one uncomplicated moment of shared, shouting celebration. A summer at the pioneer camp. Your thoughts turn, finally, to a memory of your own childhood. A summer spent at a pioneer camp in the countryside. One of thousands of similar camps operated across the country each year for children belonging to the youth organization we discussed earlier tonight. For a period of several weeks each summer, children left their families behind entirely, living instead in a structured, communal environment organized around a daily schedule of physical activity, organized games, ideological instruction delivered in age-appropriate form, and genuinely enjoyable traditional camp activities, swimming, campfires, group singing, and friendships formed quickly and intensely in the particular way childhood friendships often form when children are thrown together in an unfamiliar setting away from their normal routines. The ideological content woven into camp life was real and consistent. Morning flag ceremonies, discussions of collective responsibility, activities designed to reinforce the values the youth organization existed to instill. But for most children attending, exactly as with so much else in this story, the deeper ideological framework operated mostly in the background. A familiar, unremarkable texture of daily life, rather than something actively felt as indoctrination in any dramatic sense. What children actually remembered and cherished from these summers, then and for the rest of their lives, tended to be the ordinary textures of childhood summer camp anywhere in the world. A particular counselor who was unusually kind, a friendship with a bunkmate that lasted for years afterward, the specific smell of a campfire on a warm evening, the pride of finally learning to swim properly in the camp's lake. You remember your own summer at camp with genuine warmth. The counselors who organized elaborate treasure hunts through the surrounding woods, the nightly singing around the campfire, songs that blended patriotic themes with simple, cheerful melodies every child in the country somehow already knew by heart. You remember, too, a particular friend you made that summer, a boy from a village several hours from your own home, someone you might never have crossed paths with at all if not for the camp's deliberate mixing of children from different regions and different backgrounds. A friendship that continued through letters for several years afterward before gradually, as childhood friendships often do, fading into occasional mentions and eventually silence. There is something worth sitting within this memory specifically, because it captures so clearly the fundamental complexity running underneath this entire story tonight. An institution created explicitly to shape loyal citizens, to instill specific values, to serve a particular ideological purpose, and yet experienced by the actual children living through it, mostly as simply a wonderful, formative childhood summer, genuine friendships, and genuine joy existing entirely sincerely alongside whatever larger purpose the adults organizing the camp had in mind. The system reached deep into childhood, exactly as it reached into nearly every other corner of daily life this story has explored tonight. And children, exactly like the adults around them, absorbed what they needed to absorb, navigated what needed navigating, and still, somehow, found genuine, unmanufactured joy in the ordinary business of simply being young. The party card in the desk drawer. Your thoughts turn now to your uncle on your father's side, a mid-level manager at a manufacturing plant, and to the small red membership card he keeps carefully in his desk drawer at work. The card confirming his membership in the Communist Party itself, the innermost circle of the entire system, distinct from the youth organizations we discussed earlier, and reserved for adults who had demonstrated over years the loyalty and reliability the party expected of its members. Party membership was never universal. At its largest, it still represented only a minority of the total adult population, and this exclusivity was, in its own way, precisely the point. Membership functioned less as a religious congregation open to all believers, and more as a genuinely selective professional and political credential, one that opened doors closed to everyone else. The path to membership itself was neither quick nor casual. A prospective member typically needed sponsorship from existing members willing to vouch personally for their character and reliability, followed by a probationary period during which their conduct, both professional and personal, was carefully observed before full membership was finally granted. For your uncle, this process took the better part of 2 years, involving several separate interviews, character references from colleagues and supervisors, and a formal review of his complete work and educational history, checking for exactly the kind of family background complications we discussed earlier regarding university admissions. Any hint of prior political unreliability anywhere in his family's history. Once granted, membership carried real, tangible professional advantages. Certain management positions, certain promotions, certain assignments considered particularly sensitive or prestigious were effectively unavailable to anyone outside the party, meaning that, for a genuinely ambitious person hopping to rise meaningfully within their profession, membership became less an optional expression of ideological commitment and more a practical, almost unavoidable career requirement, regardless of how deeply that individual person actually believed in the broader ideological project the party claimed to represent. Membership also carried ongoing obligations, regular attendance at party meetings, held on weekday evenings after already long workdays, participation in study sessions reviewing current ideological guidance and policy direction, and a general expectation of visible, active engagement in party life beyond simply carrying the membership card itself. Your uncle attends his meetings dutifully, speaks up when appropriate, with carefully calibrated contributions that demonstrate engagement without venturing into anything resembling genuine controversy, and has, over the years, developed the same finely tuned instinct for calibrated public speech that runs through nearly every adult in this story tonight. Whether he privately believes, in his heart, every principle the party officially espouses is a question he has likely never fully answered even to himself. In the same way that so many people across this entire system learned to separate their outward professional conduct from whatever quieter, more complicated version of their actual beliefs they carried privately, folded away, much like your grandmother's icon, somewhere the official structure could never quite fully reach. Winter and the radiator that decided everything. As the season turns fully toward winter in your memory of this particular year, an entirely different and more universal concern settles over the household. Heat. Central heating in most apartment buildings was supplied not individually by each household, but collectively through large district heating systems that piped hot water from centralized plants into radiators across entire neighborhoods, an arrangement that, like so much else in this story, worked reasonably well as a matter of basic design, but left individual households with remarkably little control over their own immediate comfort. The heating season itself typically began and ended on fixed, centrally determined dates, regardless of the actual, weather outside on any given day. An unusually cold early autumn might arrive weeks before the official heating start date, leaving households layering on extra sweaters and blankets and waiting, sometimes with real discomfort, for the system to formally switch on according to its bureaucratic calendar rather than the actual temperature outside their windows. Similarly, an unusually warm stretch in early spring did nothing to hasten the heating system's scheduled shutdown, leaving some families opening windows in genuinely warm, whether simply because the radiators, following their own fixed schedule, continued pumping out heat regardless of what the thermometer outside actually showed, even once the heating season was properly underway. The actual temperature delivered to any individual apartment depended heavily on factors entirely outside a family's control, which floor they lived on, since heat rising through a building often meant top floors ran considerably warmer than ground floors on the same heating system. How recently the building's pipes had been maintained, and simple, unpredictable variation in how evenly a particular district's heating plant distributed its output across the neighborhoods it served. Complaints about inadequate heat were common, and like so many other minor household frustrations we've discussed tonight, addressed through the same combination of formal requests to building management and informal appeals to whichever maintenance worker happened to owe your family a favor from some earlier exchange. Your family's own apartment ran cold most winters, a persistent minor irritation your mother addressed with the same practical resourcefulness she brought to nearly everything else. Heavy curtains hung to block drafts from old window frames. An extra blanket kept permanently folded at the foot of every bed. And on the very coldest evenings, the entire family gathering in the kitchen, where the stove used for cooking provided a welcome, if temporary, boost of warmth that the rest of the apartment simply couldn't match. There was something almost cozy in this particular hardship, the family drawn together physically by the practical need for shared warmth. An entire household clustered around a stove on a bitter winter evening, which, whatever the underlying inconvenience, produced exactly the kind of close, warm family memory that outlasted, in your own recollection now, whatever discomfort the cold itself actually caused at the time. Waiting for a telephone that might never come, your thoughts drift to your parents' ongoing, years-long effort to have a telephone line installed in the apartment, an errand that, on the surface, sounds like the simplest of bureaucratic tasks, and in practice has stretched on for nearly 4 years now with no clear end in sight. A private telephone line was, for enormous numbers of households across the country, a genuine luxury rather than a basic utility, and the waiting lists to have one installed in an ordinary residential apartment could run for years, sometimes considerably longer, depending on the city, the specific neighborhood, and the existing capacity of the local telephone, exchange, serving that area. The reasons behind this scarcity were largely infrastructural rather than deliberately punitive. The telephone network itself had simply never been built out with anything close to the density found in many other industrialized countries by this point in the century, and demand for residential lines vastly outpaced the system's physical capacity to provide them. Priority for the lines that did exist tended to go first toward government offices, workplaces, and households containing someone in a position considered important enough to warrant direct communication access, leaving ordinary families to either wait patiently on the long list or rely on the alternatives that had, over the years, become second nature. A shared telephone in the building's entrance hallway, available to any resident willing to knock on a neighbor's door and ask to use it briefly, or for anything requiring real privacy, a public telephone booth on the street corner, often with a line of people waiting and a coin-operated mechanism that worked, depending on the particular booth's maintenance history, anywhere from reliably to almost never. For urgent matters, telegrams remained a surprisingly common and genuinely fast alternative, sent through the post office and delivered often within hours rather than days. A service families relied on for anything from arranging a relative's visit to sharing sudden news too important to wait for a letter. Your own family has developed, over the years of waiting for their telephone line, an entire informal system built around the shared hallway phone. A particular knock pattern signaling which family a call was actually intended for. A notebook kept near the phone where whoever answered jotted down messages for households not currently home, and a general neighborly patience around the occasional late evening or early morning call that inevitably disturbed someone's sleep. There's something worth noting in how completely ordinary this entire arrangement felt to everyone living inside it. Nobody in your building experienced the 4-year wait for a private telephone line as some dramatic injustice worth complaining loudly about. It was simply how telephones worked here. One more item on the long list of goods and services that arrived, if they arrived at all, on the system's schedule rather than your own, absorbed into daily life with exactly the same practical, matter-of-fact patience your family brought to waiting for good winter boots, or a spot on the university admission list, the quiet prestige of speaking English. At school, your cousin's younger brother has recently begun studying English as a foreign language, a subject that occupies a curious, somewhat contradictory position within the broader educational system. On one hand, the countries where English was the dominant language represented, in official ideological terms, the primary rival system, the capitalist world whose culture, values, and influence the state spent so much energy trying to keep at a careful arm's length from ordinary citizens. And yet, precisely because English had become the dominant language of international science, diplomacy, and global communication more broadly. The state also recognized, quite practically, that fluency in English represented a genuinely valuable skill worth cultivating among at least a portion of its own population. This tension produced a foreign language education system that was, in its own way, a small microcosm of so many of the contradictions we've explored throughout this entire story tonight. Textbooks used for English instruction were carefully curated, filled with dialogues and reading passages depicting, whenever possible, either neutral everyday topics or scenes specifically designed to illustrate the perceived flaws and inequalities of life in capitalist countries, offering students functional language skills wrapped carefully in ideologically appropriate content. A student might spend an entire lesson learning useful, functional vocabulary about weather or daily routines, only to encounter, a few pages later, a reading passage describing unemployment lines or homelessness in an unnamed Western city, the language lesson doing quiet double duty as a piece of comparative ideological messaging. Certain specialized schools offered considerably more intensive foreign language instruction than the standard curriculum. And admission to these schools, much like university admission generally, was competitive and shaped by many of the same considerations regarding family background and connections we discussed earlier. Graduates of these specialized language schools often found themselves on a genuinely favorable career track. Potential candidates for positions in diplomacy, international trade, journalism covering foreign affairs, or translation work, roles that came with real prestige, and notably, some of the rare, carefully vetted opportunities for legitimate foreign travel available within the entire system. Your cousin's younger brother, still years away from any of these bigger considerations, mostly just enjoys the novelty of learning new words, practicing simple English phrases with the particular enthusiasm of a child discovering an entirely new way of expressing himself, unaware, for now, of the more complicated web of prestige, ideology, and career calculation that surrounds the subject for the older students and adults navigating the system's foreign language pathways with considerably higher stakes attached. The neighbor everyone was a little too careful around. There's one more figure worth mentioning before your thoughts finally settle fully toward sleep. A man who lives 2 doors down from your grandmother. A quiet, unremarkable seeming widower who keeps mostly to himself, but whom the entire building treats, without anyone ever quite explaining why, with a particular kind of careful politeness that feels subtly different from how they treat every other neighbor. Nobody knows for certain, and nobody would ever ask directly, but a persistent, long-running rumor holds that this man once served, years earlier, in some capacity connected to state security work, and whether that rumor is entirely accurate, wildly exaggerated, or simply invented at some point repeated so often it calcified into assumed fact. The practical effect on how the building's residents behave around him has remained remarkably consistent for years. This dynamic, a suspected or rumored informant living quietly among ordinary neighbors, was throughout this system's history both genuinely real in a great many documented cases, and at the same time considerably exaggerated in the popular imagination beyond its actual scale. The security apparatus did rely, at various points and to varying degrees across different decades, on networks of informants embedded in workplaces, apartment buildings, and social circles, ordinary citizens who, for reasons ranging from genuine ideological conviction to coercion to simple personal ambition, provided information to the authorities about the people around them. But the sheer scale popularly imagined, the widespread folk assumption that virtually every building, every workplace, every friend group contained at least one active informant, likely exceeded the actual documented reality by a considerable margin. What mattered most for daily life, though, was never really the precise statistical truth of how many informants actually existed. What mattered was the pervasive uncertainty itself, the impossibility of ever being fully certain who might be listening a little too closely, repeating conversations a little too readily. And this uncertainty, as we've touched on multiple times throughout tonight's story, shaped behavior far more powerfully and far more efficiently than any confirmed informant network ever could have on its own. Your grandmother's building didn't need actual proof about her quiet neighbor down the hall. The rumor alone was sufficient to shape years of careful, polite, slightly guarded behavior whenever he happened to be nearby. One more small, permanent adjustment folded into the daily rhythm of a building full of people who had all, in their own ways, learned exactly how much caution felt appropriate for exactly which situations. The man himself, whatever the truth of his past actually was, spends his evenings now much like anyone else in the building, tending a small collection of houseplants on his windowsill, occasionally exchanging brief, perfectly pleasant greetings with neighbors in the stairwell, growing old in the same quiet, unremarkable way as everyone else in this story tonight. The rumor surrounding him perhaps outliving, by this point, whatever specific truth originally gave rise to it decades earlier. Looking up at the same stars, finally your thoughts drift upward, quite literally, to the space program, a subject that, unlike almost everything else we've discussed tonight, generated something close to universal, uncomplicated national pride, cutting across nearly all the careful caution and quiet skepticism that shaded so much of ordinary life. The achievement of putting the first human being into orbit remains, to this day, one of the genuinely extraordinary technical accomplishments of the entire 20th century. And for ordinary citizens living through that moment and the decades of space achievements that followed, the space program offered something rare, a source of collective pride that felt, for once, entirely earned and entirely uncomplicated by the usual layers of propaganda skepticism. Your grandfather still speaks. On the rare occasions the subject comes up, about exactly where he was and what he was doing on the day the news broke that a human being had successfully orbited the Earth and returned home safely. A memory shared by an entire generation with the same vivid clarity that another generation elsewhere might attach to a significant moon landing. Radios and loudspeakers across the entire country carried the news within hours, and by every account passed down through your family, strangers embraced each other in the streets, genuinely and spontaneously, in a rare moment of collective joy that required no careful calibration, no watchful glance to check who might be listening. Because for once, the celebration and the achievement were simply, straightforwardly real, and everyone in the country, regardless of their private feelings about anything else the system asked of them, could feel genuinely proud of what their scientists and engineers had just accomplished. The space program's achievements continued for years afterward. Additional milestones, additional firsts, each one broadcast with tremendous national fanfare and celebrated, by all accounts, with a warmth and sincerity that stood in genuine contrast to the more calculated, obligatory enthusiasm that greeted so many of the system's other official celebrations. There is something worth pausing on in this contrast, a reminder that even within a system so thoroughly saturated with propaganda and careful message control, genuine achievement, when it actually happened, could still produce genuine, unforced human joy, uncomplicated by all the careful caution that shaded so much of everyday life in every other respect. You drift, finally, towards sleep itself, thinking of your grandfather as a young man, standing in a crowded street decades ago, embracing strangers under an ordinary afternoon sky, all of them looking upward together for a moment at the same quiet sky that, somewhere far above the clouds, now held one of their own countrymen orbiting gently through the dark. The recipe passed down in fragments, not fully written. Somewhere between waking and sleep, your mind settles on something smaller and warmer. The recipe box in your grandmother's kitchen, a battered tin container holding scraps of paper covered in her handwriting, ingredient lists without exact measurements, instructions that trail off mid-sentence with notes like you'll know when it's ready, scrawled in the margin. Cooking in a household like yours was never simply about following a fixed recipe. It was an act of constant, quiet improvisation, shaped entirely by whatever ingredients happened to actually be available on a given week, which, as we've discussed extensively tonight, could shift unpredictably from one shopping trip to the next. A dish your grandmother might make one month with a particular cut of meat could, the following month, transform almost entirely, built instead around whatever vegetables or grains happened to be sitting on the shop shelves that week. The underlying technique and flavor profile, remaining recognizably the same even as the specific ingredients shifted according to availability. This produced, across the whole country, an entire generation of remarkably resourceful home cooks, women especially, who developed an instinctive fluency in substitution, who could look at a nearly empty pantry and still produce something warm and satisfying for a family dinner through sheer accumulated practical experience rather than any written recipe at all. Certain ingredients carried outsized emotional weight precisely because of their scarcity. A particular spice, difficult to find and treasured when it appeared, might be saved carefully for only the most special occasions, doled out in tiny, precious quantities, rather than used freely the way a more abundant ingredient might be. Your grandmother keeps, even now, a small jar of a particular seasoning a distant relative once brought back from a rare, officially sanctioned trip abroad years earlier. And though the jar has long since been used up and refilled many times over with ordinary local spice, she still refers to it, out of pure habit and affection, by the name of that original, treasured gift, a small linguistic fossil preserving the memory of a rare and special moment inside an otherwise perfectly ordinary spice jar. Meals themselves carried enormous social weight beyond simple nutrition. The primary occasion around which the extended family gathered, argued gently, shared news, and, as we've discussed at length tonight, conducted the careful, coded conversations that made up so much of honest communication in this particular time and place. The kitchen table, more than almost any other single location in the household, functioned as the true center of family life, the place where the day's small triumphs and frustrations were finally set down and shared among the people trusted enough to hear them honestly. A letter to the newspaper that went unanswered. Your uncle, the factory manager we mentioned earlier, once wrote a formal letter of complaint to a regional newspaper regarding persistent problems with the delivery of raw materials to his plant. Delays that were quietly hampering production, and by extension, making it harder for his workers to meet the targets on which their own bonuses and reputations depended. This practice, writing to newspapers or to official complaint bureaus about specific, practical grievances, was a genuinely established and, in certain respects, officially encouraged channel for ordinary citizens and workplace managers to flag problems within the system, distinct from the far riskier territory of criticizing the system's fundamental structure or leadership. Newspapers across the country regularly published sections specifically dedicated to citizen complaints and letters, addressing everything from delayed construction projects to malfunctioning municipal services to exactly the kind of supply chain problems your uncle was writing about. In theory, and sometimes in genuine practice, these published complaints could trigger real official review. A factory or local office singled out publicly for inefficiency facing pressure to actually address the problem being described. The system took a certain pride in presenting this mechanism as evidence of genuine accountability. Ordinary citizens empowered to call out specific, practical failures and see them corrected. In practice, though, the results of any individual letter were wildly unpredictable. Some complaints genuinely did trigger meaningful action. An inefficient local office reorganized. A persistent supply problem finally addressed after public attention embarrassed the officials responsible. Many others, like your uncle's letter about the raw materials, simply disappeared into the enormous bureaucratic machinery without any visible response at all. No published acknowledgement, no follow-up, no evident change in the underlying problem being described. Your uncle waited several months for any sign his letter had been received, let alone acted upon, before quietly concluding that this particular channel, at least for his particular problem, in this particular year, simply wasn't going to produce results, and shifting his energy instead toward the informal, personal connection-based problem-solving that, as we've discussed throughout tonight's story, so often proved more reliable than any official channel. There's something worth noting in this pattern, because it captures one of the quiet, persistent contradictions running through this entire system. Official channels for complaint and accountability genuinely existed, were genuinely used by millions of ordinary citizens, and genuinely produced results often enough to remain a meaningful part of daily life. And yet those same channels remained unpredictable enough, opaque enough in their actual decision-making, that most people, your uncle included, learned to treat them as merely one tool among several, rather than a fully reliable solution on their own. Always keeping a second, informal, relationship-based approach ready as a backup for whenever the official channel, as it so often did, simply went quiet. The suitcase under the bed, packed for a trip never taken, deep in the last stretch of drowsiness now, a final image rises in your mind, one your mother mentioned once, years ago, almost in passing. An old suitcase that sat for years under your great-grandmother's bed, kept quietly packed with a few essential items, a change of clothes, some papers, a little cash folded into a handkerchief, ready at a moment's notice, though for what exactly, she never fully explained, and you never quite worked up the nerve to ask directly. This habit, keeping a small bag ready near the door or under the bed, was not unique to your family. It appeared, in one form or another, in countless households across the country, particularly among families who had lived through the harshest, most unpredictable decades of the system's earlier history, when a knock at the door in the middle of the night could mean an arrest, an interrogation, or a sudden, unexplained relocation that left no time at all for preparation. Families who endured those years, or who watched neighbors and relatives endure them, absorbed a particular kind of practical caution that persisted for the rest of their lives, long after the specific dangers that that originally prompted it had eased considerably. For your great-grandmother, the packed suitcase was less a rational calculation about present-day risk and more a kind of inherited instinct, a habit formed decades earlier during genuinely dangerous years and never quite fully released even once the immediate danger had passed. By the time you were old enough to notice the suitcase yourself, tucked under the bed in the small room she shared in your grandmother's apartment, the specific threats that originally prompted the habit had faded considerably into history. And yet the suitcase remained, packed and ready, a quiet physical monument to a fear that had outlived, by decades, the circumstances that first created it. There's something worth sitting within that image as our story tonight finally winds down. An entire life lived largely in safety and stability, surrounded by a warm, loving family in a modest but comfortable apartment. And still, somewhere underneath all of that hard-won ordinary comfort, a small packed suitcase under the bed, a quiet reminder of how deeply certain fears can root themselves into a person's daily habits, persisting long after the world around them has genuinely, meaningfully changed. Your great-grandmother never spoke of the suitcase as a burden. It was simply there, the way an old scar is simply there on someone's hand, a permanent, unremarkable trace of something difficult that happened a very long time ago, carried forward quietly into an otherwise peaceful old age. The whole day gathered gently together, and so the day finally comes to rest, comrade, if we can borrow that word one more time, gently, the way this whole story has borrowed it all evening. Think back, for just a moment, over everything this one ordinary family lived through between dawn and this quiet, drowsy hour. A radio held close under a pillow, chasing a foreign voice through a wall of manufactured static. A small wooden icon touched briefly behind a wardrobe. A whole private faith folded into a single, unhurried gesture. Father slipping out for a second, unofficial job in a garage that existed everywhere and nowhere. A red scarf tied each morning around a child's neck. A whole structured childhood built around loyalty and belonging. A long afternoon spent standing in a line that, in the end, produced nothing at all. A pair of sunglasses purchased from a young man near a hotel doorway, worn afterward like a quiet declaration of selfhood. A watchful concierge in a courtyard, kind and observant in equal measure. A theater rehearsal testing, ever so gently, the edges of what was permitted. A letter from a relative on the far side of the world, read twice and folded carefully away. A knock at the door that, this time, turned out to be nothing more than a water pipe. A half-remembered foreign melody, hummed quietly by someone who had never heard the whole song. And beneath all of that, running underneath the entire day like a current, all the other lives this story gently opened for you tonight. A grandfather's war, remembered only in careful fragments. A neighbor who disappeared for a year and came home changed, his story never told in full. A communal kitchen shared uneasily and warmly all at once by 3 unrelated families. An overcrowded clinic where a small gift sometimes bought a little extra care. A young husband's 2 years of mandatory service, written home about only in the safest, most reassuring language. A teenage girl bent over her books late into the night, hoping an exam score might quietly outweigh whatever shadow her family's history carried. A sanatorium by a distant sea, glimpsed only occasionally, and a modest garden plot enjoyed considerably more often. A gray dance half-erased memory of a small family shop, absorbed into history so long ago that almost nobody remaining could describe it fully. A village collective field worked before dawn, and a private strip of land beside it, tended with far more care. A cinema screen showing exactly what years of careful, invisible negotiation had allowed it to show. A New Year tree, trimmed and lit, carrying inside its ordinary branches an entire strange political history. Nobody trimming it that evening was thinking about it all. And your mother's endless double shift, carried quietly and without much complaint. Your cousin's wedding, love, and paperwork intertwined so completely neither could easily be separated from the other. A friend's difficult divorce, absorbed slowly back into an ordinary life. Your great-grandmother's modest pension, stretched carefully across a household that loved her regardless of what she could or couldn't contribute financially. A stadium roaring with pride on a television screen. One of the rare moments when celebration required no careful calibration at all. A childhood summer at a pioneer camp, remembered now mostly as simply a wonderful, ordinary summer. A small red party card kept in a desk drawer, opening doors that would otherwise have stayed firmly shut. A cold apartment warmed, on the hardest evenings, by nothing more than a kitchen stove and the simple fact of everyone gathering close together around it. A 4-year wait for a telephone line, absorbed into daily life with barely a complaint. A child's English lesson, carrying inside its simple vocabulary a whole quiet ideological negotiation. A quiet neighbor down the hall, treated with a careful politeness nobody could quite explain. A whole nation looking up together, just once, at the same ordinary sky, and feeling, for a rare, uncomplicated moment, genuinely and simply proud. A worn recipe box, full of instructions that trailed off into, "You'll know when it's ready." An unanswered letter to a newspaper, quietly set aside in favor of an old, reliable network of favors and friends. And, underneath a very old bed, a small suitcase, packed and ready for a departure that, in the end, never had to happen. None of these lives were extraordinary, not in the dramatic sense the word usually implies. No spies here tonight, no dramatic escapes, no grand confrontations. Just people, an entire enormous country full of them, waking up, going to work, standing in line, falling in love, raising children, growing old, and finding, again and again, in 10,000 small private ways, room enough inside an unforgiving system to still simply be themselves. A joke told quietly with a tap running, a song hummed from memory. A grandmother's hand resting briefly on a small piece of painted wood. A suitcase that never needed to be used, sitting patiently under a bed for decades. A quiet monument to a fear that time, eventually, gently outlasted. That is the quiet, stubborn miracle sitting underneath this entire long day we've spent together tonight. However tightly a system reaches into daily life, however many rules it writes for how you dress, what you say, where you live, whom you love, and what you're permitted to believe, it never quite manages to reach the very last, innermost room where a person keeps the things that are truly their own. People found that room again and again. Across every decade this story has touched tonight, and they kept it warm, and they kept it safe, and they passed its key quietly down to the next generation. The way your grandmother is passing hers down to you right now, without either of you ever needing to say so directly out loud. So let the apartment go fully quiet now. Let the clock keep its soft, steady tick somewhere in the next room. Let the suitcase stay exactly where it's always stayed, packed and forgotten, and no longer needed at all. You are warm. You are safe. You are surrounded, even in sleep, by generations of people who carried far more than you will ever have to carry, and who still, somehow, found their way to rest at the end of every single one of these long, complicated, quietly ordinary days. Close your eyes now. Let your shoulders soften completely into the mattress. Let the whole long day, and the whole long century behind it, drift gently away from you. There is nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be, and no one listening who needs anything further from you tonight. Breathe slowly, breathe easily, and sleep now completely and peacefully. You are free, you are safe, and that, in the end, after everything this story has shown you tonight, is no small thing at all.